Thank you so much for joining us tonight. My name is Barry Erickson, and I'm Community Engagement Coordinator here at Wheaton Public Library. Tonight, we are proud to bring you this program, Caregiver's Guide to Finances, as part of our ACES series. ACES stands for Aging and Caregiving Engagement and Support. This program series provides a consolidated source of reliable local information and engaging programming for our community's older adults. Jim Sullivan is a retired CPA and extensively published author for the Association of International Certified Professional Accountants. He's a volunteer community educator for the Alzheimer's Association and president of a nonprofit agency paying for Alzheimer's. Jim has spent over 20 years as a financial advisor working with individuals diagnosed with a chronic or terminal illness and their families. Thank you so much for being with us tonight, Jim. I'll turn the screen over to you.
You're welcome. Thank you for that introduction, and welcome to everybody. First, let me just do a little bit of housekeeping here. You received in an email 3 items. One is the activity book that tonight, as we go through the seminar, I'll be referring to. And that has guides on some of the topics we talk about, particularly organizing your finances around Alzheimer's disease or other dementia. In fact, it is what we talk about tonight is actually helpful for any family with any chronic or terminal illness diagnosed. During my 20 or so years of practice, I focused primarily on families where an individual was diagnosed with a terminal or chronic illness. I became interested in how that impacted their household financial plan, and that's what I worked on. And many of my clients were Alzheimer's patients. I also did work with clients who had Lou Gehrig's disease. I worked with the ALS Association of Greater Chicago, Parkinson's, various cancers, but I just found it a rewarding career in the sense that when a disease is diagnosed, the old financial plan is in effect broken. And they need to reconstruct their financial plan given the reality of the diagnosis. And that's what I helped families do. And that's what I found so rewarding, because the diagnosis is so traumatic, creates a lot of anxiety. And one of the things I felt that families could do in the face of that diagnosis is first get organized and deal with the issues as they come up. And I always told them it's never as bad as you think it is. And if we go through my financial plan that I create for you and we find out there's shortfalls, that's when we can get to work. We can redesign your program, and I'll talk about how that's done in the context of the disease in just a few minutes. So there's the activity book. There's also an article I just published in the August issue of the Journal of Accountancy, and that took a very close look at Alzheimer's disease and how that impacts a financial plan, and how a planner needs to be familiar with the stages of Alzheimer's when they're working with the family and the individual diagnosed with the disease. And I thought that would be of some interest to many of you who are right now struggling with that issue as the disease progresses. How does that impact our finances? Finally, I talk tonight during the presentation about key takeaways. During the presentation itself, I think we go through 6, but there's actually many more, and that I don't necessarily hit on, or a lot more content that I don't necessarily hit on during the presentation. But I sent out a 2-page key takeaways that summarizes some of the issues we talk about during the seminar, that bring up a few other topics that we don't have time to talk about during the seminar. And there's a second page that talks about some of the changes that Part D, prescription drug coverage under Medicare, is undergoing, not only in just 2023, but in 24 and 25. I think in particular, there's good news for lower income families, middle income families who are struggling with these costs. And I just wanted to make you aware of them as we go through and talk about the financial planning for families faced with these disease diagnoses. A little bit of background on me. I am a retired CPA. For many years, I worked for a large international accounting firm. And as I said, my professional career after I left the international firm, actually, I should say the firm left me. Our firm collapsed in 2001 and 2, Arthur Andersen. But my focus became working with families where there was a disease diagnosis. 2 years ago in November 2021, one of my older sisters, Kathy, passed away from a rare dementia, a vascular dementia, referred to as Binswanger's. It's not very well known. And she lived up with her family in the Green Bay area. And it's very hard when you're living in a rural area to find neurologists and others who are experienced with Alzheimer's disease, which is a dementia. Even harder to find someone who knows anything about a rare dementia called Binswanger's. At any rate, like many dementia patients, Kathy did not die of the disease. Kathy actually, like other dementia patients, Alzheimer's, Lewy bodies, as you get further into the disease process, you begin to lose some of your most basic life functions, like how to swallow. And that's what happened to Kathy. She was at lunch, she couldn't swallow. The nurses didn't get to her in time. She was at a nursing home and she choked, lost a lot of oxygen. They put her on life support, but after 3 days, my brother-in-law and their 3 kids opted to go ahead and end the life support because they told them that her brain was already so damaged from the vascular dementia, the additional loss of oxygen would render her, in effect, really helpless if they didn't pull the life support, which they did. A year ago in October, I lost my older brother, Rick, to Alzheimer's disease. He was diagnosed probably about 4 years prior to that. It moved fairly aggressively. Rick held a PhD in economics and was an economist for the Federal Reserve in Kansas City. And I would drive out there to help my sister-in-law, Leslie, and Rick dealing with some of these financial issues. It was heartbreaking to me because Rick was always exceptionally good at mathematics and statistics. As the Alzheimer's disease took hold, it became difficult even to have him understand basic mathematics, arithmetic. And somebody so bright and so smart deteriorated. Eventually, we put him in a nursing home for the last 4 or 5 months of his life. But like my sister Kathy, he passed away. In this case, he did die of Alzheimer's disease. So our family is don't have stories that are much different from other families struggling with this disease. But at that point, I had decided we were fortunate that both my brother Rick and my sister Kathy, their families had resources that they were taken care of. What I thought was actually frightening to me is all those families, lower income families, where this disease comes on top of having of living paycheck to paycheck. And I thought, how do those people manage their lives with this diagnosis? And that's why I started a non-for-profit entity called Paying for Alzheimer's. Our goal is to help educate people about how you arrange your household budget, your household finances around the Alzheimer's diagnosis, or as I said, any diagnosis. I've worked with families in the area where a member was diagnosed with ALS. And if you're familiar with Lou Gehrig's disease, it's a horrific disease. But these are really principles that carry over from disease to disease. Each disease presents differently. And we even within a disease, Alzheimer's, my brother's Alzheimer's presented differently than other people. His was aggressive. He died after about 4 or 5 years of the diagnosis. Others, people can last 10 or 11 years with Alzheimer's. I had a friend in my church whose wife lived 12 years with Alzheimer's disease. So it presents differently among the people who have it also. So our goal at Paying for Alzheimer's is working with families, all families, but in particular low-income families. So we never turn anyone away because of their inability to pay our fees. We have scholarships available that we can work with people. And one of the things I have found that has surprised me is that people are not aware of how many financial aid programs there actually are, both for Medicare, Medicaid, and then they have to be educated about those programs in order to take advantage of them. Tonight, we're going to talk generally about building a financial plan, no matter what your income level, and the impact that Alzheimer's disease and other dementias have on your planning. So our learning objectives tonight are first to describe how caregiving affects finances, list the legal and financial documents that caregivers should put in place, prepare for useful discussions about financial decisions and planning, identify steps to lower the chances of financial abuse and fraud, begin to create a backup plan in case you can no longer provide care. And this is one area that I have found most families do not have. I have worked with families that have been called in where all the planning effort was directed at the ill family member. And there was virtually no care planning, no planning for the caregiver. Then, of course, the old saying, man plans and God laughs. The plan fell apart. A lot of times the caregiver became sick because of stress, or they died. And there was no backup plan in place as to what to do when that occurred. And if you think about a lot of typical families where there might be 3 or 4 adult kids, all with their own families, there's a mom and dad at home. And let's say in this case, the mom has Alzheimer's, dad's taking care of her, and suddenly he dies. And the question becomes, what happens? Is there money to be able to afford to bring someone in for care? Can one of the kids help? Can they help as a team? What's the plan? And I always encourage families that should be done well before it's needed, because you really need to think through about that backup plan. So we're going to spend some time on that. Learn how to budget for the costs of caregiving, and then finding resource or sources of financial assistance. One of the things we do is track different sources of financial assistance, and it's much easier to do nowadays on the internet, and help guide people, particularly lower income and middle income families, to some of the on-site sources of financial assistance, whether it's help paying for drugs, help some, and I'll mention there is a foundation called Hilarity for Charity that was started by Seth Rogen, the comedian, and his wife, and they actually give small grants out to families so that the caregiver can take a break, and the foundation's grant will provide for respite care. Somebody will come in and take care of the ill spouse or the ill grandparent, and then the caregiver can actually get away for a few days and reduce their stress and relax so they don't end up getting ill and being unable to provide the care. Another site called acl.gov, the association, or it's for community living. They also have, if you put in your zip code, they will also provide you sources of grants for families. And then another great site that I talk about all the time is called the Benefits Checkup. .org. That's done by the National Council on Aging. If you go to benefitscheckup.org, and it's unrelated, you put in your zip code, you put in some information on your financials, your income and your assets, and it'll turn out a large report on all the programs located in your area that may be providing support, whether it's Meals on Wheels, assistance with or signing up for Medicaid, veterans benefits. But it's a great tool that I think is underused, but is something that I use all the time. Our focus, as I mentioned, will be on 6 key takeaways, very practical takeaways that you can leave tonight and implement quickly. The key takeaway number 1 is to be proactive. I believe that by being proactive when it comes to any disease, reduces the anxiety that the disease brings with it, improves the quality of life for the caregiver and the person diagnosed with dementia or any type of chronic or terminal disease. And being a retired CPA, I always think a great way to organize the families is by first looking at the household budget, the finances, because that's probably the second or third thing people think about when they get the diagnosis. What can we afford the care that I want to provide to my spouse? One of this project goes back 2 or 3 years ago. I was working with a family up in Minneapolis. Their father, they had 7 kids, was diagnosed with Lou Gehrig's disease. So I went up to Minneapolis quite a bit to meet with the family. And the wife took me aside one day when I was about to leave and said, I would like to be able to quit my job and stay home and take care of Brian during his last few months. Can we afford that? And I told her, to me, money is nothing but a tool. When we talk about putting together a budget, looking at the finances, the cost of care, what we're trying to decide is what's there to help pay for care. If there's a shortfall, how do we deal with it? But it's just a tool that helps you accomplish the most important thing, which is getting the care you feel your loved one needs. So I told her, yes, what you're going through in losing your husband to this terrible disease, you're only going to go through once. I don't want you to look back and wish you had stayed home with him, to feel some regrets. So let me work on the budget. Let me figure out a way to find the money. And then you can quit your job and stay home with Brian during the last few months of his life, which was what she was able to do. And so that's what we're talking about here, being proactive, deciding what are the finances, what do we need to improve, what are other sources, and most importantly, I want to get the care to my spouse, my children, parents, that I really feel they want and deserve. So I tell families when I first meet with them that given the diagnosis, your old financial plan is broken. It needs to be fixed in light of the diagnosis. So there's 2 things we focus on. First is a care budget. That's looking at the income of the family month to month, and then looking at their typical expenses, and then adding to that 2 things that impact their income the most. One is if the ill individual was working and has to quit his or her job, that impacts income. If their caregiver also was working and created income for the family and has to reduce their hours or quit, that's going to impact income. On the other side of the income statement, you're going to look at the expenses. What expenses are going to be incurred because of the disease? I always suggest or strongly recommend that families join support groups, no matter what the disease is, whether it's ALS, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's disease. A support group can be a great source of information. In fact, when I've done a number of speeches to ALS support groups, one of the things that impressed me was how many of those members of the support group, how many of their spouses had actually died years before. And when I asked them, why do you still come to the support group? It was just to provide just that support for the other members of the group who are just starting their journey with this disease. And they felt an obligation to pass on the assistance they received years ago. So we create a care budget. It doesn't go out more than a year or 18 months. It's hard enough to do a budget accurately, let alone throwing in something like a disease that's going to make it very difficult to predict what those costs are going to be. Again, that's where a support group, that's where healthcare professionals, particularly nurses, can be helpful in describing what some of those expenses may be and what the course of the disease is likely to be. A care balance sheet is what most people think of when they set up a household budget. I'm going to set up a bunch of buckets, and each bucket is going to be a financial goal. So I have a bucket over here for my kids' college education. I have a bucket set up for a big vacation that we're planning, a bucket set up for retirement, maybe one set up for car repairs or unexpected large expenses. When you have the diagnosis of a disease, the focus of the care balance sheet changes. And this is probably the most difficult issue I deal with families. Because normally, let's say a family, in this case, my family up in Minneapolis, Brian had ALS. He bought his own individual insurance policy. He worked for a large employer, but he had bought a $500,000 policy on his life, just as added insurance should something happen to him early. Now, when I looked at the policy, it provided an accelerated death benefit. In other words, if he were diagnosed with a terminal disease, they would pay up to half the death benefit to the family to pay for care. So that's $250,000 that they didn't even know would be available to pay for care. Now, their initial reaction, almost as always, and this was Brian's, I bought that policy for my kids and my wife. I didn't expect the proceeds to be used for my care. But I told him, in this circumstance, what we're really doing is we're trying to pull together your assets in a way to reduce the anxiety, particularly of his spouse, about where is the money coming from that's going to help pay for Brian's care. We may never touch this policy, and as it turns out, we never did. But it helped give his spouse some comfort that the assets were there. Some were unexpected. Home equity is another source of funding for care, but very few people pay off their home mortgage thinking that someday I want to use it for my care. Normally, they just want to get the mortgage. They want to own their own home outright. But again, we're looking at the care balance sheet for a little different purpose than we were before the disease was diagnosed. What we're looking for is sources of funding for care. Retirement plan assets are another source, but I'll point out to them that if we take money out of the retirement plan to pay for care, it's more than likely that's going to be taxed. You're going to have to pay a toll charge to pay that, to get a hold of that money. So let's go and look for other assets like a home equity or a reverse mortgage or an advanced death benefit that will not be taxed, that can be used for care, and we don't see 20 or 30% of it eaten up by taxes. Now, the outcome here is really, once you create a new plan, you can focus on what is really important, planning for the care needs of your loved one. And that's the sole purpose of my working with families. The organization, it helps reduce anxiety. There's a lot of good reasons why you do that. But really what I'm trying to do is get them focused on being able to plan for care, which to me is the most important thing you can do. Now, one of the things that has happened recently makes planning early even more important. It's best to start before symptoms appear. Now, years ago, that would be considered ridiculous because the only way you really had to determine if somebody had Alzheimer's disease were their clinical symptoms. Now they're beginning to use blood tests that can help you discover if somebody many years before the clinical symptoms appear may have a tendency to having Alzheimer's disease. And if you can determine that early enough, think about if you can determine that Alzheimer's disease is likely in a woman, say, of age 45, and their clinical symptoms won't appear till 65, you can start to plan early for the Alzheimer's disease. In addition, this new drug, Leqembi, was approved by the FDA on July 7th of this year, as is Medicare's way of doing things. Once it was approved by the FDA, Medicare will now pay for the drug. One of the things that is not understood by people that is Leqembi is an infused drug. You take it through an IV. So it is not under Part D of Medicare. Part D is prescription drug coverage, and that really only applies to drugs that you ingest, tablets, pills, inhalers. Leqembi, because you have to go to an infusion center or a doctor's office, is covered by Part B. And we'll get into that a little later. There's a huge difference where it's covered by Medicare Part B and not by Part D. It's likely that Leqembi will be very expensive, probably $2,000 or $3,000 per month for the infusion. And we'll talk about how that impacts and how people are going to be able to pay for the cost. Medicare Part B will pay for 80% of the cost. 20% of the cost, or as much as $600 a month, would be payable from the beneficiary, unless the beneficiary has a Medicare supplement plan that will step in and pay for the drug. Since July, I'm only aware of one client who has gone through the protocol with his doctor and has been approved for the drug. He hasn't received it yet. Just as an aside, I was actually in a study with Eli Lilly, and they did blood tests on me. And then I was just about to begin some infusion as a test subject, where 50% receive the infusion of the actual drug, 50% get a placebo. Well, this was in, I believe, August, when they thought I might have had a mini stroke, which I didn't, but I take blood thinners, and the doctors from Eli Lilly decided that I shouldn't go forward with the test because one of the side effects of these drugs is brain bleeds. And they thought if I'm already taking, in this case, warfarin, and have a tendency to, or a danger of having a mini stroke, a TSI, then they should kick me out of the program, which they did. If you wait until the symptoms appear, it is too late to do effective planning for finances and, more importantly, for care. So there, if you look at my article from the August issue of the Journal of Accountancy, you'll see how early planning, long before symptoms appear, is just in. It just has to be done. It has to be something done by the individual, the husband and wife, say, and their family, friends. Can they sit down and start talking about what if one of us has Alzheimer's or another dementia? Let's start planning for care and costs. The benefits of early planning for the caregiver are you knowing the person's wishes. You're comfortable that you're going to be able to make important decisions for him or her and make the correct decisions based on your earlier discussion. You know better how to handle financial issues and pay for care. What I always suggest is there's a caregiver who's in charge of finances, and he or she should have a backup. The reason being that if that person who's in charge of the finances becomes ill, passes away, somebody should be able to step in fairly quickly and understand where the money is, what bills need to be paid, how they get paid. And that's all a benefit of early planning. You have less chance of making costly or unwise decisions that you regret later, or that you feel that the patient would have disapproved of. For the individual with the disease, you can better share exactly what it is you want and help them make decisions. One of the things that I think people should be very careful with is when they're dealing with somebody, say a sibling, and he or she is taking care of their brother or sister who has dementia. For as long as you can, include that person who's ill in the planning. Especially that even comes to when you're at a meeting with both of them, including the person with the disease in the discussion, ask them questions, include them as much as you can. It's important that you continue to see the person and not the disease. I remember a client of mine, he was a musician, and his wife died of, she had early onset Alzheimer's disease. She was diagnosed, I think, at 59 and passed away at 64, 65. And he played a variety of instruments. And I was talking to the daughters one day at the funeral, and they said that their mom loved music. And when they were with her at Jewel and they lost sight of her, they would just stop and listen. And invariably, their mom would either be singing or whistling, and they'd be able to find her. On her last night of her life, her husband brought an instrument with to play some of her favorite songs. And despite the fact she couldn't recognize him, couldn't talk, from somewhere deep inside her, she was able to recognize the tune and actually began humming along with it. So when people are well into their Alzheimer's journey, there's still, I believe, something left of them inside that should be respected and honored and not ignored. I know it's not easy to do, but it is something I've made a point, and I've had to learn to do it myself. The individual also gets reassurance that others know their wishes and will follow those wishes about what to do with their money, what donations they want to make, if there's any money left over. And finally, relief from having legal and financial plans in place. One of the early signs I think people see of when the early clinical signs of Alzheimer's is when people who are normally very well organized, particularly with their finances, become neglectful of those finances. They start missing bills, not paying them. They start making purchases that they wouldn't have normally done, running up credit card bills. I was at the Berkeley Public Library doing a presentation, and one of the attendees mentioned that for her mother-in-law, they didn't notice the signs right away. And by the time they got involved and started looking at her finances, this normally very conservative, financially conservative woman had run up $60,000 or $70,000 in credit card debt, making purchases that were for her nonsensical. And that's one of the first signs. And that's why the sooner you can talk to your parent or your sibling, if you think there's a problem, you can head off some of these issues. And that's one of the things we do at Paying for Alzheimer's. We work with a counseling agency that works with people who have excessive credit card debt, because we found that time and again, that was missed by the other family members, and it has to be something that's untangled as part of our planning process. Planning early, what you want to do is make sure everyone understands the disease progression. That's what I cover in my article. There is a natural reluctance to discuss money issues. There are hidden issues, as we talked about, credit card debt. There's what I call the money tension problem. And that is when I've walked into families to work with them because someone's been diagnosed with a chronic or terminal illness, there is a natural tendency on the part of the individual who is sick not to consume all family assets for their care. And they'll tell you that. I don't want my family going bankrupt by spending too much on my care. And a lot of times they'll joke a little bit, just stick me in the corner and let me die there peacefully. Now, of course, the family's view is different. For them, they'll pay whatever they need to make sure their loved one gets the care that they think he or she wants and they think he or she deserves. So, and a lot of times when I've walked in, this has never been fully discussed. In fact, a lot of times when I've walked in, believe it or not, family has not even talked about the disease being terminal. I found that early on with Alzheimer's disease, a lot of families and a lot of spouses, they were at the doctor's office, and I'm sure the doctor told them it was a terminal disease. I'm also sure that the well spouse did not hear that, did not want to hear that. So there's this money tension problem that has to be resolved. And to add to that, when I've walked in, I think sometimes I should have been a social worker, although I'm not sure I would have made a good social worker, because then they'll also talk about the disease and have not confronted the issue that it's a terminal disease. When I asked a friend of mine, when his spouse first was diagnosed with Alzheimer's, I said, what did you talk about when you left the doctor's office? And he said, well, the first thing, we left the doctor's office and we thought we would be surrounded by nurses handing us materials, telling us what the next steps are, because doctors are smart, but they only can tell you you have the disease. Doctors do not tell you how to live with the disease. But they walked out and he said she might as well have been diagnosed with a cold. So he went home. This was in the early 2000s and started going through the internet, looking up information. And he said, the interesting thing is between the time of her diagnosis and her death, we never called it Alzheimer's disease. We called it her brain problem, her brain illness, but we always found euphemisms for what she was going through. And although we both knew in our hearts that it was a terminal disease, it seems like we could never really bring ourselves to talk about it. And that's what happens a lot of times when we walk into the middle of a family group. These are just the discussions they really haven't had. And I've always told them that to me, and this is where the Alzheimer's Association can help, bringing in a social worker to get these things talked about, and so that people can understand when these issues come up. There are a lot of tears. They're really tough to go through, but families have a way of not talking about all the issues. And certainly our family is no different than others. With my particularly my sister, we didn't really understand what Binswanger's dementia was, and I don't know if we really ever mentioned to each other that it was terminal disease, but it was. She didn't die of it, as I said, but it's not something that is easy to talk about among families. I have there were 6 kids in my family. 4 of us, 2, Rick and Kathy, have passed away. So it's something that we didn't talk about openly either. And you would think I would have brought it up, but frankly, when it's your family, it's different, isn't it? The new reality is when you do financial planning in the face of a diagnosis, what I tell people is you're going to make the best choice from a list I'll give you that are of poor options. In other words, you're going to look at it and you're going to say, Jim, we don't want to use money from my life insurance policy just for my care. That's not why I bought it. We don't want to take a reverse mortgage because I don't want to use up the home equity on my care. But what I tell them is that's the position we're in. We have several choices we can choose from, but they're a poor list of options, and you have to go through one by one to pick the best one of those. Now, in a lot of cases, you don't end up using all of them. In fact, you may use none of them because we find other solutions to the financial problems, but it is something that has to be discussed openly. Another difficult topic is survivor planning. That became difficult for me, obviously, with my sister-in-law, was married to my brother Rick, and she spent her career in public health. She's brilliant when it comes to research and issues. And when I had my own health problems several years ago, Leslie was always helpful to me in interpreting what the doctors were telling me. But she hates household finances. Rick did all the work on it. He was the economist. So when I went there, when Rick had gone to take a nap, and I said to Leslie, we have now got to start planning for what happens after Rick's gone. And that is an easier thing to say when you're talking about an unrelated client than when you're talking about your own brother. But it's important to me that my sister-in-law be prepared financially for his death and was comfortable that we had things in place for her that she would survive financially. A lot of times, and I talk about to families, they make a promise never to put their loved one in a nursing home. That to me should be modified to say, I'll never put you in a nursing home as long as it's safe for you to stay at home. Because what happens is, as the diseases progress, it becomes more dangerous to leave the person, their loved one, in a home living alone. You can bring in help. With my brother, Rick, Leslie tried to bring in nurses to care for him, but he hated it. Eventually, he had to be put in a nursing home. And then the first few weeks he was in the nursing home, Rick, who was a gentle, good man, became violent and actually attacked some of the nurses. And they told us that either you have to let us put him on drugs and sedate him, or we can't have him here, obviously being violent against our caregivers, which we understood. So they put him on some drugs to keep him calmed down. But that's how he spent his last month or two of life, very heavily sedated. We also want to reduce the chances of financial abuse and fraud. Unfortunately, most financial abuse and fraud takes place by family members. It's devastating to deal with families who are thinking more of their own finances after their loved one is gone than they are thinking of the care that could be provided. In fact, I had a friend call me because they were having an issue with he's a tax return preparer, and they were having issues with a family that was refusing to have treatment given to their dad because they thought they would have to pay the bulk of the treatment costs. And they didn't want to do that because that would eat into their inheritance. And he said, well, what can we do? And I said, this is a problem for an attorney, but I suspect the attorney will tell you you have to get a guardianship, which ultimately they did. But it's sad. I haven't seen it a lot, but it is sad when you see it. People thinking of themselves first. So planning early, and as a CPA, I love to help people get organized. A lot of people have very unorganized finances, and one of the first things we do is sit down and simplify them, take a look at what their assets are, get them organized. And I think that goes a long way to getting the family focused on the care provided, then rather than just always constantly worried about money. So financial discussions, the earlier the better. Talking about money can make people feel anxious or uncomfortable, making it hard to start to know how to start the conversation. I know my dad died in 1992 of heart disease, and my mom lived for another 4.5, 5 years after that. And I grew up in a house that I guess was unusual at the time. My mom did all the finances, and my dad, who was a traveling salesman for Scott Forsman, the company that started the Dick and Jane reading series, never really paid much attention to money. But my mom was very organized. I was put in charge of her finances when she was told she had lung cancer, and she was very proud of the work she did to get organized to make it as easy as possible on me. But for most people, it's hard to start a conversation. And like a lot of families, a lot of times it's the person who's sick who's most responsible for the finances. Always seems to happen, right? And so now you have to talk to the person who's sick, not only about the finances, but how to transfer that responsibility to either the surviving spouse or partner, or get that person some help so that they can pull everything together. To start a discussion about finances, write down your goals and what documents you want to review or discuss. For example, investment statements, retirement accounts, include trusted family members or close friends. I always tell people the first tip I think shows that somebody is financially abusing the patient is when they want to isolate the patient and have nobody talk to them alone. And I tell people that. To me, that they don't want to leave the person alone to talk to anyone else. They want to isolate them. And that's just something to keep in mind. And I always encourage families have a primary financial caregiver and then a backup, as I mentioned, so that person has somebody they can talk to, go over decisions. And I tell them don't take it personally, but just to make sure everything is done properly. Choose a calm time of day and a quiet place. Most of you who are caregivers recognize that the person you're taking care of has better times of the day to talk to than others. It might be late in the afternoon. So pick that as the time to talk. Pick a quiet place so they aren't distracted. Encourage honesty. Don't judge a person based on what they're going to tell you. Otherwise, they won't be honest, and I don't think you'll accomplish much. Don't rush. There's no prize for getting it done quickly. Take your time, and if you have to, split it into several sessions, particularly if the patient tires easily. Just some additional tips. It can be hard to ask for help managing finances, particularly for someone living with dementia. And sometimes a person living with dementia may have paranoid tendencies. So they think you're asking for the wrong reason. So it takes patience. One of the things I like to do during these sessions is recommend books I like. One of the books that I think came out in the past few months Travelers to Unimaginable Lands by Dasha Kipper. It is an amazing book. It goes through why a healthy brain finds it so difficult to communicate with an unhealthy brain, with the patient, and all the different things that you struggle to go through and get frustrated with as a caregiver. But Dasha Kipper's book, Travels to Unimaginable Lands. Check, maybe Wheaton Library has a copy, or should get some copies. It's a wonderful book. The other one that's a staple for most people is the 36-Hour Day, which talks about, gives a comprehensive overview of Alzheimer's and dementia and how to care for those people. Ask about the person's wishes. Don't judge the person or their decisions. If a person has difficulty communicating, speak in short sentences and pause to make sure they understand what is being said. I found with a lot of my clients that I had to, if I wanted to include them in the meeting, I had to change how I communicated to make it as easy for them to feel like they were included and feel like they had a say in the matters. So I had to start talking in shorter sentences. I had to slow down. I also found out, and this is when I was younger, now that I'm 68, I realized the wisdom of what somebody told me. Pausing, sometimes when you're older, you pause to think about the answer you're going to give. Well, to someone who's in their 40s, that can be annoying. And so they rush to fill in the void by making some inane comment. Because I would do that. Like, I can't stand the silence. And now that I'm at the other end and I pause to think about a response, it annoys me that somebody can't just shut up and let me finish my thinking before I say something. If the conversation becomes stressful, stop and try again later. Always try to end on a positive note. Check in regularly. This is not a one and done situation. Check in, update the plan regularly, and talk to them in most cases. And then one of the things I always did is go to the client's home, because after a certain point, clients are really not able to travel easily, particularly my ALS clients who are homebound fairly quickly. But check in regularly, whether it's by phone calls or Zoom. In the workbook, the activity book that I gave you, there's a section on having conversations about finances where it reviews many of these issues for you. And you can use it, kind of map out your own strategy. Key takeaway number 3 is to identify legal and financial needs. We're talking about the broken financial plan and how do we recreate that given the realities of the diagnosis, and updating legal documents. Many families that I start to work with still have legal documents that are 10 or 15 years old, and the people listed on them, many of them have passed away. So you need to update legal documents. You can use the internet to create these documents. I always tell people, if you can afford it, hire a good local attorney. I think in the long run, that's cheaper than trying to do it yourself, but you can always give it a try. I think an attorney brings some experience to these issues that most of us just don't have. So update legal documents. My wife's dad, before he died, and he died in the mid-70s, many of you on the phone will recommend, or on the Zoom call, will recognize, stationery stores. Well, there's no such thing as a stationery store anymore, right? So he would go and they would have blank documents, blank legal documents that he filled in because he was too cheap to hire an attorney. And so after Otto passed away, his first family, his first wife died of a cancer. And my mother-in-law, Janet, my wife's mother, her first husband passed away from a cancer. So they married, and the kids from his first marriage sued my mother-in-law. It took 5 or 6 years. They ended up in the Illinois Supreme Court, and it cost her a lot more than just hiring an attorney in the first place would have. So it cost more in the long run than it would have in the short run. The financial impact on households, I've already mentioned. Income frequently goes down while expenses go up. And this doesn't really matter the level of income. Any loss of income for most families, even families who have substantial income, will cut into their standard of living because most people tend to live paycheck to paycheck. So their income goes down, expenses go up, and that's what doing the care budget takes into account. The unique challenges of dementia for dementia caregivers. They have twice the average out-of-pocket caregiving costs, and most people don't realize this until you become a caregiver. But often you're paying out of pocket for the patient's expenses, and that can amount to quite a bit of money. In the 36-hour day, I think there's been 6 or 7 editions of it. One time I reread the book, and I'd put a $ by every time they mentioned buying something that was inexpensive. Well, by the time he got done with the book, there were 200 inexpensive things they recommended buying, which for many families is not affordable. And that's why some families, ALS, and I think Alzheimer's, a lot of these organizations will have local closets where you can go, and if you can't afford certain items, that you can go and either borrow or they'll give them to you. One example is when somebody is, no matter what the illness, a lot of people, as they get further along in the illness, have trouble manipulating their hands and can't do the buckle on their pants or their zipper or their belt. And so they recommend getting them something like hospital pants, sweatpants that's easier to put on and off. But all of that adds up, particularly when then you get some items in the shower to protect them from slipping. And the caregivers often pay that out of pocket and it becomes expensive. Almost a majority of dementia caregivers experience depression. And that's why I'm a big advocate of 2 things. One is support groups, I think is helpful. And 2 is respite care. And that's why I mentioned it early on, Polarity for Charity and other organizations that will give small grants to families so that somebody can come in and take care of the patient while the caregiver gets a couple of days off. Maybe it's only overnight. Maybe it's just for the day so they can do something that they used to like to do, like antique shopping. 44% of caregivers have anxiety. The disease itself is anxiety producing for the patient, and the disease, the unknowns of the disease, the unknown costs, the unknown progression of the disease. It presents in everybody differently, and you don't know that, and so anxiety just increases tremendously, particularly when you go through some rough patches where the behavior of the person with the dementia is so difficult to understand. And that's, again, why I recommend, if you're struggling, Travelers to Unimaginable Lands. It's just a eye-opening book. Women are more likely to experience the stress of caregiving. When my mother-in-law, she died at 106 months old. At the same time, she was near the end. I was going through my own health problems. And so my wife was actually taking care of both of us. So you can imagine the stress she's under. And it's just very similar to your families, where the caregiving stress leads to illness, can lead to death. And you have to make sure the caregivers take care of themselves first, or everything else can fall apart. Organizing finances. We already talked about income and spending. We talked about taking inventory of assets and debts. And again, we're doing it slightly different than a traditional financial plan. We're looking for assets that can actually generate cash to pay for caregiving if that's needed. Debts, we're looking at, has the patient run up debts lately that are totally out of character with that person? And how do we take care of unsecured debt and get that taken off his or her credit report? Because in most cases, the person can't afford to pay the debt. Identify the costs of care. Again, caregivers in a support group can be helpful identifying that. Nurses in particular can be helpful. Identifying the costs of care, and much depends on the progression of the disease. For some people, the disease takes years. As I mentioned, a friend of mine at our church, his wife spent 10 or 11 years with Alzheimer's. Others, particularly if it's early onset, only last 4 or 5 years. But those are difficult years, and you want to be able to identify the costs of care. Can you take and leave that person at home and take care of them there, which is usually the preference? Fortunately, and I don't know how much time we'll have to get into this, there's a lot going on at Medicare to test providing more support for home caregiving than they have in the past. What they just came out with, I think in October, early October, I was on a call with Medicare. It's called the GUIDE program, GUIDE. It stands for an acronym that I can't think of it right now, but it's actually an excellent program as designed. They're going to start testing it within the next few months to just provide more support for caregivers at home, meaning training, meaning putting together a group of people that can provide support. And I think I'm optimistic that we might be on the right track to helping families taking care of a loved one with a dementia or any other serious chronic illness. In the activity book, there is some ideas of how to put together a book on, or a care budget. It helps you over on the right-hand side identify utilities, medical expenses like grab bar, medicine dispensers, incontinence products, prescription drugs, and we'll talk about that more in a minute. In fact, we'll talk about it right now. Some of these items I put in larger type than others because I think they are more important for us to discuss quickly than others. For example, personal resources, income, 401k or other retirement accounts, but those might be taxable if you draw them out of the account. Home equity, a reverse mortgage might be the answer in many cases. It's not preferred answer, but as I said, we'll come up with a lot of lousy options from which you make your choice. Savings, stock and bonds, personal property, federally funded sources. And this is Medicare Parts A, B, and D, I think, unfortunately, are overlooked by people when they get a diagnosis. People tend to think that Medicare is a choice you make when you turn 65 and then you're done with it. But Medicare actually has a lot of ways you can make changes to your coverage as your health needs change. And we don't have time to talk about those that are available, but that to me is the first thing I look at for a family. What elections has a patient made with Medicare? Is there an opportunity to improve those elections that better meets his or her needs? Social Security disability income or insurance, SSDI, can be helpful if they're under age 65. One often overlooked source is supplemental Social Security income, SSI. People tend to think that's not available to most people, but actually some elderly who have very small Social Security checks may actually be able to get SSI at the same time, but it's often just overlooked. And one of the focuses we have at Paying for Alzheimer's is educating people on what's out there, because in some cases, 50% of the people who are eligible for some of these benefits, 50 or 60%, aren't even aware of them. And the financial assistance they provide can mean a big difference. Another is Medicaid dual eligibility, I think is overlooked. If I'm on Medicare because I aged into it, now I'm 68. If my income and assets are low enough, I may be actually eligible to get into Medicaid. And a lot of those co-payments and co-insurance and deductibles that I pay because I'm in Medicare become picked up by Medicaid. And you apply for Medicaid through, in this case, the state of Illinois, but that can make a big difference. And a lot of people have never even heard of the concept of dual eligibility, but you do qualify based on your income and assets, and it can be very helpful. Other sources, I mentioned this earlier, the ACL.gov is the Administration for Community Living.gov, and they have some nice sources of financial assistance that when you put in your zip code will pop up. So that's helpful. Hilarity for Charity, I mentioned. The PAN Foundation is a private foundation that helps people pay for their prescription drugs. It's arranged by each illness is a silo. So if you have Parkinson's disease, for example, you can apply and get financial help for drugs that are meant to help Parkinson's patients. But once that money runs out, you have to wait until the next round of funding to get assistance. But it is, I think, a very good fund. I think it's an excellent foundation, and they also do a lot of very good training pieces at their site. I mentioned the National Council on Aging, the www.benefitscheckup.org, and I think I don't care what income level you are at, it's worth going in. It doesn't take long to answer their questions, and they'll generate a report. As a test once, I went in and I created a fake client with very little assets, very little income. And I think I live in Glen Ellen, so 60137 zip code, and I generated a 190-page report listing benefit after benefit I might be eligible for and can apply in. So it is a great source of help for everybody. The Alzheimer's Association has a 24/7 helpline at 800-272-3900, staffed by master's level social workers that can help you primarily with care issues for your loved one, but can refer you to other resources. With your legal plans, I won't say much about this. If you hire a local attorney or you do it online, you have to bring everything up to date, review the legal documents, make sure that people who you put down as having the power of attorney 15 years ago are still willing to perform that, or are still alive or not sick and can't do it. At the very least, make sure these documents are in place and are up to date. The durable power of attorney for finances and health care. Some people will split that to one person be in charge of the POA of finances and another person for health care, a living will. And again, we talk about online or use of a local attorney. My preference is a local attorney, but I think you can also accomplish a lot through the online. And if it's hard to afford, there's legal aid that you can call, but it takes, I think, a long time for you to actually get assistance from them. In the activity book, there's organizing your legal plans, some tips. Takeaway number 4 is reduce the risk of financial abuse and fraud. The average loss is almost $40,000, which just surprised me. But it's something that you have to be aware of. Financial abuse can occur in any setting. Individuals living with dementia have a greater risk of becoming victims. They may not remember or report the abuse. A lot of times they're embarrassed if they do remember it and don't want to report it. They don't want to tell their kids about it or family members or friends. They may struggle to make good financial decisions. A study I saw once, I think when you're in your late 50s, you peak in your ability to make financial decisions, and then it starts a slow decline. So as you get older, your ability to make good financial decisions decreases. Some signs that a person may be having problems with money: unopened bills, electricity or gas gets shut off, unusual or large purchases, multiple of the same item or things they don't need, repeat donations to telemarketers, missing money or unexplained bank withdrawals. One of the things that really irritates me, we're currently in the annual enrollment period that began October 15th, last to August 7th. Telemarketers are not allowed to call you about your Medicare choices. You have to give them permission. But we've been inundated with calls that they sound like they start from overseas. They come to, because I've fielded several of them, and then they'll turn you over to a local insurance agent, and I'll actually go through it, and then I'll tell the insurance agent what you're doing is illegal, that you are not allowed to do this. But a lot of them will plead ignorance. Well, I didn't know how these leads are made, but I told one, you're lying, that these calls are not only abusive because they come in so frequently, but I think you're taking advantage of a population that will listen to their promises and make inappropriate changes to their Medicare selections. Missing money or unexplained bank withdrawals. Just quickly, for a book I wrote on financial abuse, I interviewed a lot of the bank managers or presidents around the Glen Ellen, Wheaton, western suburbs, and without exception, all of them said you should use local banks and come in frequently to do your banking business so we get to know who you are. And if you can, bring in your adult children so we get to know who they are. And then if you come in with a stranger making an unusual transaction, often the teller, recognizing that, will come and get a manager or the bank president, draw their attention to it, and he or she will put a hold on it until they're satisfied that there is no financial abuse going on. So I know nowadays banking online is more popular, but being able to go into a local bank is, I think the Glen Ellen Bank I like because they always have, I don't know if they still do, but they have free chocolate chip cookies. So you want to lower your risk of abuse and financial abuse and fraud. Agree to a spending limit on credit cards. Create a separate account for recreational spending. In other words, if you set up an account with the debit and give the patient, say, a debit card, but you never put more than $200 in it or maybe $50 in it, then they can't get too taken advantage of. Set up auto pay for bills. Set up automatic notifications for withdrawal or late or large charges. My only problem with that is by the time someone's been financially abused and the money's been taken out of the account, you might as well count it as gone. It's much better, I think, to have access to the account. You don't need access to make any changes to the account, but just to be able to look at it every day and follow the see if there's anything that looks odd going on. Request electronic bank and credit card statements. I'm not sure that is, I agree with that, because electronic bank and credit card statements are often thrown out in the trash. Years ago, when the only way you could get your social security check was through the mail, people knew when those checks were coming out. At the time I was in college, I worked at the post office delivering mail, and the retirees, if I walked up to their door and didn't have their social security check in my hand, I was held personally responsible for that check not being there. Now, with electronic banking, you don't have statements that you throw out in the trash, and you can keep better track of your social security deposit. Get up on the do not call list. That has been useless lately with these calls from what I think are foreign call centers, because I'm on all sorts of do not call lists, but it hasn't stopped any of them. Ask credit card companies to stop sending balance transfer checks. And as I said, get to know your friendly local banker. There's some tips in the activity book on avoiding or minimizing the risk of financial fraud. Here are some legal and financial sources of information that you can, if you want the list, just call me or send me an email and I'll send this to you, since you don't have the copies of the slides. But all of them are good. Particularly, the National Foundation for Credit Counseling, I think most people are not familiar with. But when you're older and you run up credit card debt, going to credit counseling, it's not their first choice, but it's their only choice in order to maintain a good retirement. Those problems have to be dealt with. A backup plan is essential. I think I've talked about that enough. It's a difficult conversation to have when you're dealing with the potential death of the well spouse, but somebody has to be able to step in quickly to take care of the patient, particularly if that person is taking medications, and you need to help manage those, taking those doses. Caregiver, take care of your health. And that's the reason for the backup plan. What happens if the primary caregiver cannot provide care? Unfortunately, that's thought of too late after something happens to the caregiver. But most families need to have someone that can step in, even if it's just temporarily, while the caregiver is sick for a couple of weeks, to help provide the care that's needed. These are pretty standard. Again, building a care team to assist with caregiving responsibilities is essential. That includes family, friends, church members. I have a client who's going through the last stages of ovarian cancer. Now she's trying a new drug at the University of Chicago, but it may actually temporarily render her blind. So she has already set up a team from her church that will provide her assistance. You can imagine, if you're sighted, you don't even know the extent of the care you'll need if you're blinded for 2 or 3 weeks because of the drugs. She had a treatment today, and so we'll find out if that's going to happen. Doesn't happen to a lot of the people on this drug, but it does happen, and you need a care team already in place. And of course, she had more than enough people volunteering to help. It was nice to see. Final word or two, we've talked about Lakembe. The annual enrollment period goes through December 7th. use this period as a time to review all your Medicare coverages, not just your prescription drug, but whether or not, given your change in health needs, you can't make better choices with your Medicare. The annual enrollment period gives you flexibility that most people don't think use properly. In fact, I think the last statistic I saw is 70 or 80% of people don't use this as an opportunity just to review their coverage and see if they're making decisions properly. And in a lot of cases, for example, in Medicare Part D, I doubt there's a situation I haven't seen one where some money hasn't been able to be saved by picking a different plan, because the plan formularies change so frequently and there's so many moving parts. And you can do that yourself on Medicare.gov. But it's an easy way to save money, to make sure you're making the right decisions. The Alzheimer's Association is a great organization. They have online, you can go to alz.org. You can call their 800 number, which is 24/7. They have support groups, which I encourage people to go to. I know some people aren't outgoing or extroverted, and it's hard, but it is a wonderful place to learn and to become a better caregiver, and to also have a better idea of what to expect, and to share your stories and your heartaches with people who understand. So thank you for your attention tonight. I don't know if we have time for a few minutes for questions, if there are any, or you can certainly call me or email me with any questions you think of later.
Thank you so much, Jim. This was great information. There were a couple of questions about receiving the materials that you referred to, and I tried to answer those in the chat, but just to be clear, I sent out, along with the reminder email, that activity book, the key takeaways page, and the article. A couple of people asked slides as well, and if that file isn't too large, I'll try to attach that in a button in the follow-up email for people to download as well.
Yeah, in the past, that slideshow had those videos attached, and then it was almost too big for your computer. Now that those are off, you might be able to send them. So
yeah, absolutely. I will give it a try. And I will just mention here that if you're watching the recording of this program at a later date, you can always email me at ce@wheatonlibrary.org. That's CE for community engagement at wheatonlibrary.org, and I'd be happy to send all of those materials out to you. And I'm just going to remind people to go ahead and put their questions in the chat. And as we're waiting for people to kind of formulate those, Jim, you did make a couple of recommendations of books that might be helpful to people. I did look in the library's catalog, and we don't own those, but I will include the titles in the follow-up email. And I also sent those to the staff member that makes this collection decision. So hopefully they'll be added to what we have here at Wheaton Public Library in the next couple of months.
yeah, and I don't know if I mentioned this other book I'm just finishing. It's called A Journey of Faith by Edward Brennan, and it is an amazing. He's a very good writer, but it tells of his own mom's struggle with Alzheimer's. At the same time, he had his own severe addiction problems, alcohol and drugs, that he had to fight through, and so it always thought, am I going to get Alzheimer's because the damage I did through my drinking and drugs? But he is a wonderful storyteller, and if you have a book club, I think that and Journeys to Unimaginable Lands are great additions.
Great, thank you. Someone is asking about the recording of the program. We have to do a little bit of tweaking in the library's IT department, but I will be sending out the link to the recording once it becomes available, probably next week. And that will go out to everybody who registered for the program, and not just those that attended tonight. So you'll see the link to that. And of course, again, a lot of our ACES programs were able to record, so you can take a look at that seniors tab on the library's YouTube page for all of those different programs. There's things, everything from lowering your utility bills to eye health, like keeping our eyes healthy, to there's even like an armchair tour of Kyoto, Japan. So just lots of different things there for people to learn from and enjoy. So,
And then if you could just ask people to send their name and zip code.
right.
That's
Yeah.
all we need. We don't need email addresses or addresses, just so our funders know that we're out there and we're busy.
Right. I did put that reminder in the chat as we were going along, and a couple more people added it, but that's a great reminder, again, just to show compliance for the grant. I don't see any other questions. So I think there's just been a lot for people to digest. So thank you so much for being with us, Jim. This is an excellent presentation. Thank you for allowing us to record it so that people can watch it again or forward the link to a friend or someone that they know that needs this really important information. Again, if you're watching the recording of this program and want the links to those various resources that we've talked about tonight, just email me at ce@wheatonlibrary.org. That's CE for community engagement @wheatonlibrary.org, and I'd be very happy to send those things out to you. Again, don't see any other questions, so we'll say good night. Take care, everybody, and we hope to see you again soon.
Yeah, good night.
Thanks again, Jeff.
You're welcome.